Welcome. My name is Dan Anderson. I'm a mental health clinician and I consult organizations regarding stress, resilience, and wellness. Normally, I present this material live in person, and since I'm not able to do that today, I've included my contact info, and I invite anyone to call or email with any questions that might come up. This is the second in a series of videos. I call this Stress 101B, and it describes sources of stress, some of which are unique to high-stress occupations. In future video segments, I'll cover techniques for stress mitigation, building resilience, and staying healthy. We will cover a few different models used to identify sources of stress, including models for occupational stress, and some sources unique to specific high-stress occupations. We will also discuss self-talk and define attribution style. We will cover secondary traumatic stress, traumatic memories, and compartmentalization. Before we proceed, unlike the physically measurable biological conditions that we reviewed in the previous video segment, models of where stress originates and why are much more subjective. So, there are multiple different models that are considered accurate depending on the perspective that we are wanting to examine. The first model we will review was developed way back in 1967 when a couple psychiatrists, Thomas Holmes and Richard Rahe, were studying the connection between psychological stressors and physical illness. And on the way to do so, they learned that there was some consistency around which events people reported being more or less stressful. So the researchers tried to assign numerical values or points based on the responses given by the subjects in their study. I'm sure you'll recognize some of the stressors listed, and you may also notice that some on the list have shifted over the last 50 years. So when it comes to how we experience stress, context and perception are important. Some of you may be familiar with the ACEs study. The takeaway from the ACEs study is that if we can reduce the number of certain types of stressors that children experience, that their long-term adult health outcomes will improve. Also, if you are an adult and if you experienced a significant number of these stressors as a child, then you may be predisposed to certain negative health outcomes. One principle that the 1967 Holmes and Rahe study and the ACEs research have in common is that they both reflect the accumulated stress model, which essentially says that multiple stressors accumulate to increase the level of stress that an individual is subjected to. This graphic illustrates this model by indicating examples of stressors on the right which can accumulate to increase an individual's stress level, and examples on the left of behaviors that can reduce the overall stress level. The next slide introduces the idea of occupational stress and categorizes different sources of stress based on job-related stressors. The categories here are A. Stress unrelated to the workplace. We're all subject to these regardless of our occupations. B. Stress inherent in job duties. These are stressors that come with the job. We can't prevent them, we can only learn how to respond to them in the healthiest ways possible. And C. Stress related to organizational issues. These I consider unnecessary job stressors, things that can be changed to improve the work environment. This graphic illustrates the demand control model developed by Robert Karasek from MIT in 1979. Karasek's research originally linked certain types of jobs with greater stress. The research eventually determined that the demands of the job were less significant when it comes to stress than the amount of control an individual has in their job. In the graphic, we see that jobs with high demand can result in either unhealthy stress or a highly engaged employee, depending on the level of control the individual has in their jobs. This principle can be applied outside of the workplace as well, such that when an individual feels powerless without choices in their lives, it is more stressful than if the individual feels empowered with choices. Lastly, this model points towards the idea that the impact of stressors are to some degree dependent on the perceptions of the individual. So, better to focus and expand on areas in your life where you have more choices and control versus focusing on areas where you feel powerless or have fewer choices. In the last slide, we talked about the demand control model and the importance of our perceptions regarding stressors. Now we're going to touch on how we can influence our own perceptions. That is through practicing positive versus negative self-talk. Self-talk is something that everyone has. Some are more aware of it. It is an inner dialogue. It's not hearing voices. Self-talk can often be subconscious background noise that we're not even aware of. Self-talk can be positive and helpful or negative and unhelpful. Everyone experiences both. Self-talk is not about positive people versus negative people. We are all susceptible to unhelpful self-talk at times. Self-talk can be reinforced, positive or negative, based on practice. Practicing increased awareness of our own self-talk can eventually strengthen the ability to direct one's own self-talk. The next two slides are a little heavy with technical language, so I'll try to get this through without putting anyone to sleep. I include this information because when I present materials on stress, inevitably there are individuals that have questions about PTSD. So we're going to review the criteria for PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or ASD, acute stress disorder, and the criteria for a diagnosis, which is a very specific set of criteria published in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, now in its 5th edition, published by the American Psychiatric Association. So this language is directly out of the diagnosing criteria. Before we start, I want to preface with 2 requests. One is please do not diagnose yourself or your friends or coworkers. Leave that to professionals. 2, please do not assume that if you do not meet the criteria for PTSD or ASD, that you are not affected by stress or that you do not deserve help or support. As you are about to see, the criteria is somewhat arbitrary, and I'll explain what I mean by that. First, let's look at the criteria, Part A, which is regarding traumatic events. So there are 4 different ways that one can experience traumatic events that would qualify for these diagnoses. Directly experiencing the events, witnessing them in person, learning about these events having occurred to a close family member or friend. Lastly, experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to the details of traumatic events, such as in the case of first responders. And there's a Critical note in the criteria, it says regarding criteria 4, this does not apply to exposure through electronic media, television or movies, pictures. And this is the important part, unless this exposure is work-related. So Part B in the diagnosis of PTSD or ASD are symptoms, and they have to be present in particular quantities and types. So the first type are intrusive symptoms, including recurrent, involuntary, intrusive memories or dreams. B would be dissociative reactions, in which case the individual feels in some way that they're not fully present. Flashbacks, which you may have heard of, fall in that category. C would be significant psychological distress or physiological, meaning biological reactions to cues which are associated with the traumatic event. So if you see something that reminds you of the event, you would have potentially distress reaction. Section 2 are what are called avoidance symptoms. Avoidance symptoms are efforts that we make to avoid distressing memories, thoughts, or feelings. Category 3 are negative alterations in cognition or mood. So could be gaps in memory, exaggerated negative beliefs, distorted thoughts, blaming self or others, persistent negative emotional state, diminished participation in significant activities, feelings of estrangement, inability to experience positive emotions. The diagnosis requires that 2 or more of those symptoms in that category be present for a diagnosis. Fourth category is alterations in arousal or activity. So that would be irritability, angry or aggressive behavior or outbursts, reckless or self-destructive behavior, hypervigilance, an exaggerated startle response, concentration problems, or sleep problems. And again, diagnosis requires 2 or more of those symptoms in that category to be present. Category 5 is impairment in social or occupational or other areas of functioning. When I said that the PTSD criteria is somewhat arbitrary, what I meant is this. If someone meets all the required criteria, except only 1 of 2 symptoms in a certain category that requires 2 minimum, then technically they cannot be diagnosed with PTSD, which seems rather arbitrary. The individual in this example might be suffering greatly, regardless of whether or not they meet the criteria for a PTSD diagnosis. Let's talk for a moment about secondary traumatic stress, or STS. Secondary traumatic stress is the stress that results when an individual is exposed to the trauma of another. As we learned in the last set of slides, secondary traumatic stress can result in a PTSD diagnosis. In case of secondary traumatic stress, an individual may be present for the traumatic event. It could be listening to it on the phone, as in the case of a 911 dispatcher. They could be hearing or reading about it at a later date. So exposure to STS does not always qualify an individual for a diagnosis such as PTSD. But even if they're not diagnosed or meet the criteria, that does not mean that they're unaffected. So the takeaway is we want to acknowledge secondary traumatic stress when it occurs. We want to take the time to allow oneself to experience and process or emotional reactions. This slide is a list of possible indicators of experiencing secondary traumatic stress. So indicators can be emotional, physical, what we call personal indicators, or even workplace indicators. I'm going to review some information here on what's called traumatic memory. Some researchers believe that traumatic memories can be processed incorrectly within the brain and central nervous system, and that the associated information, images, sounds, smells, etc., also thoughts and beliefs, emotions, bodily sensations, are all recorded together with the information about the event in our memories. That these undigested memories can be below the level of our conscious awareness, yet still affect us and drive uncomfortable symptoms. Healing can involve facing and unpacking these memories to reduce their power in our lives, desensitizing us to them and allowing them to be processed as other memories are, saving the information that can be useful to us without the intense emotions or unhelpful ideas attached to them. So given time in a healing environment, this process can happen naturally without assistance. Sometimes healing can get stuck or delayed for a variety of reasons, and intervention, possibly with a mental health practitioner, is helpful to allow the healing to proceed naturally. Now a discussion of compartmentalization. Compartmentalization is a coping skill that allows individuals working in or around trauma to defer their emotional experience of direct or indirect trauma. So folks are able to put it off rather than experience that emotional reaction immediately. So this skill is necessary for folks to perform their jobs sometimes when exposed to trauma. Depending on their job, they're often required to continue to focus on the needs of others rather than acknowledging and tending to their own reactions. So this necessary coping skill is an asset which can become a liability when individuals attempt to defer the emotional experiences continuously or indefinitely. So the takeaway is acknowledge the stress. Take the time to allow oneself to experience and process those natural, normal emotional reactions. Thank you for listening to these first two video presentations on stress. I hope that you've learned something helpful regarding chronic, acute, and traumatic stress. I end on this slide with the two brains and the brainstorming of ideas, partly to let you know that while the first couple of videos are focused on defining some problems with stress, later videos will get into topics about what we can do to stay healthy. The next video topic will be the practice of mindfulness. And as I mentioned at the beginning, if anyone has any questions after reviewing this material, they are welcome to call or email directly, and I'll be glad to discuss your questions. Thank you and have a great day.